The atrocities committed in Hamas's attack on Israel have shaken the world, yet China's response was lukewarm at best. That's because despite saying it could be a peacemaker in the Middle East, China has actually been screwing over both Israel and Palestine. Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. As you may have heard, Israel and Hamas are waging all-out war after Hamas launched a multi-pronged attack from the Palestinian territory of Gaza, going door to door, killing and kidnapping hundreds of Israelis. I'll spare you all the gruesome footage, but it was bad. Much of the world has strongly condemned the Hamas attack, including the United States, the European Union, and the country of Taiwan. But you know who hasn't condemned Hamas? You guessed it, China. To be fair, China condemning human rights abuses is like Ash Ketchum condemning cockfighting. Yeah, that's what Pokemon is. China's foreign ministry kept its comments short and vague, saying China is deeply concerned over the current escalation of tensions and violence between Palestine and Israel. We call on relevant parties to remain calm, exercise restraint, and immediately end the hostilities to protect civilians and avoid further deterioration of the situation. It doesn't matter who attacked whom, all relevant parties should remain calm. China never explicitly named Hamas or mentioned its actions. Instead, China went on to recite calls for a two-state solution with an independent Palestine and said it's working with the international community towards peace talks between Israel and Palestine. It was very measured, kind of like how China called for an end to hostilities after Russia invaded Ukraine without explicitly pinning the blame on Russia. I guess because China isn't used to blaming people that are actually responsible. My hamstring is still sore after doing the mental gymnastics necessary for how China says the US is responsible for COVID. Israel's embassy to China was disappointed with China's lackluster response and said, "We hope that China can provide solidarity and support to Israel at this difficult moment." Even U.S. Majority Senate Leader Chuck Schumer, who was in China with a delegation at the time of the attack, blasted Chinese leader Xi Jinping over China's Israel-Hamas stance.
I urge you and the Chinese people to stand with the Israeli people and condemn these cowardly and vicious attacks. I was very disappointed, to be honest, by the foreign ministry statement that showed no sympathy or support for Israel during these troubled times.
He's disappointed in China? Here's some advice, Chuck. Stop expecting the CCP to act reasonably, and like me, you'll never be disappointed. Just furious. Constantly. Why hasn't China condemned Hamas? Well, China doesn't want to burn any bridges with the Muslim world. While some Muslims in the Middle East condemn the attacks, others are more sympathetic to Hamas. Some have even praised and endorsed its actions. China doesn't want to offend Muslim countries by siding with Israel, even if it means not condemning the terrorist organization Hamas. In fact, China recognizes Hamas as a legitimate political organization and treats it as such. According to Asia Times, China refuses to designate Hamas a terrorist organization and has even once called it the chosen representative of the Palestinian people, even though Hamas took control of Gaza by force rather than election. So they think Palestinians chose Hamas the same way Kanye said slavery was a choice. Got it. This has earned China a lot of flack, especially in 2006, when Pakistan's then Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mahmoud al-Zahar, who was one of the founders of Hamas, attended the China-Arab Cooperation Forum in Beijing. China denied having invited him. So what? They were filming the sequel to Wedding Crashers? Yeah, China-Arab Cooperation Forum Crashers really rolls off the tongue. But that denial didn't stop Israelis from getting angry. Things have simmered down since then. In fact, over the past few years, public opinion of China in Israel has been fairly high compared to the US, partly thanks to Chinese investments into the Israeli economy. And China is determined to play both sides. For China, the Israel-Palestine issue isn't something worth losing trade and influence over. China has even offered to moderate peace talks multiple times, but a lot of it is just rehashing the same ideas. After China brokered a deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran earlier this year, Many asked if China was preparing to genuinely make a run at Israeli-Palestinian peace. But given the state of things these days, I highly doubt it. China doesn't really have the political tools needed to seriously broker peace, and it couldn't care less about either Israel or the Palestinians. The only tools China is going to employ are drills, the second they get a crack at all that Middle Eastern oil. China prefers to treat them both like political pawns, and in so doing, is screwing over both of them. I'll tell you how after the break. Welcome back. China tries to have it both ways by maintaining close ties with both Israel and the Palestinians, but really, it's taking advantage of both of them. Let's first start by looking at Chinese-Israeli relations. They go back a long way. Back in 1950, Israel was the first country in the Middle East to recognize the People's Republic of China. But cooperation only really kicked off after 1992, when China and Israel formalized diplomatic relations. Trade has grown exponentially ever since, especially after they signed a bilateral comprehensive innovation partnership in 2017. Israel exports arms to China, according to the Institute for National Security's studies. In 2020, trade with China constituted 10.7% of Israel's global trade, which amounted to over $110 billion. That puts China in third place among Israel's trade partners, behind the EU and the US. But in terms of imports, China became Israel's largest source of imports in 2020, with over $9 billion in goods. What especially interests China is Israel's advanced technology. Because China is like that kid back in elementary school who acts like your friend, then you'll find out that it's only because you have a Super Nintendo that they want to steal the designs of and try and recreate. Israel is one of the most innovative countries in the world, so it's no surprise that China has been investing heavily into Israeli tech companies and infrastructure. Israel, meanwhile, sees a lot of positives from greater economic cooperation with China, which is why it turns a blind eye to things like China stealing data, among other things you'd think Israel would be sensitive about. And dealing with Iran, the same country that wants to destroy Israel. Israel even affirms the One China policy against Taiwan. So, what does China do in return? It treats Israel like a red-headed stepchild. Despite seeing Israel's strategic value, China uses Israel as a diplomatic punching bag. China regularly chastises Israel for its walls and West Bank settlements using Palestinian rhetoric. Whenever conflict rises, China urges Israel in particular to stay calm and exercise restraint, like it did earlier this year. Yes, because if there's any country known for operating restraint, it's China. That's why nothing happened in Tiananmen Square in 1989. Nope, nothing at all. China even puts in effort to condemn Israel at the UN Security Council, which it also uses to attack the US. For example, in 2021, after tensions flared up in Gaza, China said the US had undeniable responsibility for the conflict, and said that the US harms Muslims after it blocked a UN statement on violence in Gaza. China loves exploiting conflict to cast blame on the US, even if it means using Israel as a prop, like Chinese officials did when they spread this Grim Reaper meme. You'll notice that it shows the US as the Grim Reaper wielding Israel as a scythe to go around killing other countries. For any younger viewers watching this, if a friend makes a meme insinuating that you're a mass murderer, they're not your friend, especially if they themselves are mass murderers. Even now, China is using the current conflict between Israel and Hamas to prove that the US is the enemy of world peace. But while it might not be as obvious at first glance, the Palestinians are also getting screwed by China. I'll tell you about that after the break. Welcome back. China likes to use Israel for its own selfish interests, but it does the same thing for the Palestinians. Now, talking about China's relationship with Palestine is tricky because there is no state called Palestine. There are Palestinian territories like Gaza and the West Bank, but they're not all controlled by the same groups. There's Hamas in the Gaza Strip and Fatah in the West Bank. So it's hard to talk about China's relationship with quote-unquote Palestine. Back during Mao's day, China supported a lot of liberation movements throughout the global south. This included arming and training Palestinian groups like the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Revolutionary ideology soon took a back seat, however, but China has made sure to keep good relations with the Palestinians. Chinese leader Xi Jinping's take is that the fundamental solution to the Palestinian issue lies in the establishment of an independent Palestinian state based on the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. Despite constantly saying it wants to make peace, China has never made any serious moves to make it happen. According to a researcher at Israel's Institute for National Security Studies, Beijing knows that. But it's easy virtue signaling, positioning China as the global savior of Islam despite what is happening to the Uyghurs. That's right, the country that doesn't want to offend Muslims is committing genocide against Muslims. For any younger viewers watching this, if a friend is committing a genocide against, well, anyone, they're not your friend. According to the United States Institute of Peace, by showing solidarity with the Palestinian cause, an issue of immense importance to the world's 1.8 billion Muslims, Beijing likely wants to distract from its policy on the Uyghurs. China's blatant exploitation of the Palestinians doesn't stop there. Earlier this year, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas visited China, but the visit showed how China was much more concerned about how it looked to the world rather than Palestinian statehood. Even the Palestinian Authority officials recognize that China is absorbed by its own interests. An unnamed Palestinian Authority official told The Guardian that Abbas's invite to China is about China showing its power and making the U.S. look weak. Regardless, the Palestinian Authority is fine with China using it for self-promotion as long as China makes Israel look bad and legitimizes the Palestinian cause. In return, Abbas has sided with China on a lot of issues. When Abbas visited China earlier this year, he supported Chinese initiatives that are basically meant to put China in charge of an alternative world order to the US-led one. He even backed Beijing's crackdown on its Muslim minorities, which is like a mouse approving of a snake's diet. The Palestinian Authority said issues regarding China's policy toward Muslims in Xinjiang have nothing to do with human rights and are aimed at excising extremism and opposing terrorism and separatism. Palestine resolutely opposes using the Xinjiang problem as a way of interfering in China's internal affairs. Is it just me, or did the Palestinian Authority just throw the Uyghurs under the bus to get legitimacy from China? Even Israel has done a better job of condemning China's treatment of its Muslim minorities by signing a joint letter to the UN Human Rights Council on that issue. Granted, this was done under pressure by the US, but still, why would the Palestinian Authority be willing to look the other way for China on its mistreatment of Muslims? Why does anyone tolerate China for any reason? Money. China inked its strategic partnership with the Palestinian Authority earlier this year. But given how deals with China, especially its Belt and Road Initiative, generally leaves countries both heavily indebted and full of poor quality infrastructure that fall apart, I wouldn't expect them to gain much long term. The only thing most countries get from China is I turned a blind eye to ethnic cleansing in China, and all I got was a slightly cheaper t-shirt shirt. Oh wait, you don't even get that since that's our merchandise. Available now at ChinaUncensored.tv/merchandise. In fact, despite its lip service to the Palestinians, China's really holding back from giving any meaningful support. Earlier this year, China made a big deal about how it donated $1 million in humanitarian aid to assist Palestinian refugee children. That sounds like a lot, but that's just a drop in the bucket compared to the US's $500 million in aid in just a year in 2021. The US continues to give a lot more than China. Under the Biden-Harris administration, US aid plans to program at least $500 million between 2021 and 2024 in total support to the Palestinian people. Compared to the billions of dollars worth of trade between China and Israel, China exported less than $250 million to the Palestinians and imported less than $337,000. In practice, China puts a lot more energy into helping Israel's economy than the Palestinians. They're all talk with very little to show. Really, when it comes down to it, China's acting like everyone's best friend when they're really just using them and pitting them against each other for their own benefit. Just like Ash Ketchum. Now there's a video I want to show you about the rise of anti-Semitism in China. But first, want to be more helpful than China? Then support China Uncensored on patreon.com/China Uncensored. All it takes is as little as $1 an episode, and you can set a monthly limit. And as a thank you, I'll respond to your comments. Today's comment comes from Flora Chen. China has a long history of committing genocide and destroying the languages and culture of the people in its surrounding regions. Now that's an excellent point. Despite all the Maoist talk of liberation, one of the first things the CCP did was invade Tibet and wage a genocide. In Inner Mongolia, they waged a genocide. In Xinjiang, they're waging a genocide. And if they ever take over Taiwan, there'll be a genocide there too. I recently spoke to China researcher Ethan Gutman, who pointed out that the CCP has started saying the problem in Taiwan is that there's too much Japanese blood mixed in with the population. Wonder what they'll do about that if the party ever took over. And that's why anyone who thinks China could be a peacemaker between Israel and Palestine, or Russia and Ukraine, or really have any positive impact in the world is pretty stupid. Which is why I want to show you this video about anti-Semitism being on the rise in China. It's insane what's happening. Thanks for your support, Flora, and thank you for watching. Click that orange button to support China Uncensored on Patreon. And once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.